is a distinctive portrait of the person of Jesus. Especially with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can certainly see they're closely connected, very similar. John is unique among those four. But there was an attempt in the early church to blend the four of them together and make one gospel, the Diatessaron. That was never what the church selected. So the church has kept four portraits canonically in our New Testament. So that's important. And four living witnesses to the person of Jesus. And I suppose, it's four communities, four evangelists who each have a deep love for the Lord. They're each expressing in their own way, the person of Jesus. So that's in some ways very appropriate. If we look at Matthew and Luke, each one of them, intimately linked with the Gospel of Mark, but whereas Mark makes it clear that Jesus is the Son of God, and we, the reader, know it from the moment of his baptism as an adult, both Matthew and Luke are not satisfied, in a sense, introducing an adult Jesus. So they both give us birth narratives, different birth narratives. We often don't pay attention to that very carefully, but we rarely reproduce Matthew's birth story. Why is that? What's the big story in Matthew? We don't think about at Christmas a lot, unless you go to the Feast of the Holy Innocents. I always tease Deacon Mike about this. We do this walk through Bethlehem, but we never do the slaughter of the innocents. With it. So I probably have some teenagers who would dress up like Roman soldiers and might enjoy that. But we're not going to do it. But Matthew's narrative of the birth of Jesus is focused on the figure of Joseph, dreams that he receives. Whereas the Gospel of Luke is focused on the angelic appearance to Mary. So each one has their own unique approach. Sometimes interesting to read the two side by side, but both make it clear in their own way that Jesus is the Son of God from that very first moment that he is conceived in the womb of Mary. This child to be born from you will be called Holy, the Son of the Most High. Now, with the fourth portrait, John's Gospel, John is not even content to take us to the birth of Jesus. As we saw in that first chapter, he takes us all the way back to before creation itself. The Word was with God, the Word was God, and it was through the Word that the universe itself was created. And in the fullness of time, that Word became flesh and dwelt among us and pitched his tent, as it were. And that Word has been made manifest, became human in the person of Jesus. So I think that as you look at the development and the understanding of Jesus, the awareness of his divinity deepens in the gospel tradition over time, and appropriately so. I also said about 4 weeks ago that when those who lived in the first century met Jesus the first time, they experienced him fully as we experience each other here in this room, face to face. So they saw him eat and drink, they saw him rest, they saw the need that he had to relieve himself like we all have to clean his body. All the human things that we experience, they experienced it firsthand. So for them, probably there was no doubt about his humanity. What slowly became clear to them was there's something more to him than his humanity. And that's where the great mystery unfolds. And those who believed in faith, and especially in light of the resurrection and the gift of the Holy Spirit, and came to that full awareness of his divinity, that was the surprising, astonishing revelation to those earliest men and women who encountered Jesus on the roads of Galilee. So what we're going to do today is we're going to trace the mystery of how Jesus was understood and interpreted and experienced after those four Gospels. So after the early writings of the New Testament were written. So, and I mentioned before that, the faith in Jesus as Christ, our Lord and Son of God, was handed down by the earliest followers of Jesus even before we had written Gospels. So faith in Jesus came with the gift of the Holy Spirit, particularly with Pentecost and the resurrection, and that gift of faith carried the early church forward in its tradition, and all the writings of the New Testament are fruit of that faith of the early church. But that gift of faith and who Jesus was handed down faithfully by each Christian generation, even after the writing of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The real question becomes, as time goes on, the questions that begin to unfold about Jesus are, but, human, divine, one with God, one with humanity. So in the 2nd century, you have a variety of Gospels that are written. One of them is called the Gospel of Thomas. One is called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. You have other Gospels that are written about the person of Jesus. And every year about Christmas time or Easter, you'll see a newspaper article, or Time or Newsweek, one of those news magazines, will have an article that will say, Church's Hidden Gospels reveal some new truths about Jesus that the church kept hidden for 2,000 years. You'll see an article like that, which will imply that these Gospels written in the 2nd century have better knowledge about Jesus than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the church kind of suppressed them, kept them secret from us. And if we go back and read those things, we can learn new things about Jesus. Well, it's very interesting. That was the period in which a philosophical movement known as Gnosticism was flourishing. In the 2nd century, the Gnostics, I'm oversimplifying, but if I can oversimplify it as well as I can, the Gnostics believed that we human beings are trapped in a world that is fundamentally evil and corrupt. And we need special knowledge. The Greek word gnosis means knowledge. We need special knowledge to be set free from this evil material body that we live in, this evil material world. So it was a dualistic viewpoint, that this world is evil, but the world of the Spirit is good, and it takes a certain secret knowledge to be freed from this evil body and evil world. So people who had this belief, who also became Christian or were in the orbit of Christianity, would often write these secret Gnostic Gospels. And they would say, well, we have secret hidden knowledge about Jesus that was never public, that the apostles never preached. So that claim that we've got the knowledge, and you've got to find the right knowledge to be set free. So but the problem with this is that Jesus, of course, appeared to have a human body and live a human life. So the Gnostics said that was only an appearance. So he only appeared to be a human being. Because the human flesh is evil, the physical world is evil, so God would never have become really human. So he only looked human. So the name for this is called Docetism. By the way, the Docetists also believed that a lesser God created the physical universe. So no true spiritual God would have created a physical universe. So you had a lesser God who created the physical universe and the human body, but the higher God was pure spirit, would never have created materiality to begin with, which is what we're all trying to get out of it. So with this belief, Jesus never really had a human body. He was never really human, because to do so would mean that he was evil, and so you couldn't corrupt him. So that's what the Docetists believed. Now, suffice it to say that those who knew Jesus personally, his family, the apostles, those who ate and drank with him, would never have believed such a thing. But in the 2nd century, removed from the actual Jesus of history, you could see how they could believe such things. Now, it's interesting. The early Christian community and its leaders had to respond to this, and they did. So St. Ignatius of Antioch, one of the early bishops of the church who also died for Christ, he died in 107, he says that Jesus was fully human. And he goes on to say, he was both fleshly and spiritual, both born and unborn. God became human from both Mary and from God, first subject to suffering, then incapable of it. And he goes on to say, and St. Irenaeus will repeat such things, he really was born. He really ate and drank. He really was persecuted under Pontius Pilate. He was really crucified, died, and rose from the dead. This is the faith that has been handed down by the apostles publicly. So that's how they argued against the Docetists in the 2nd century. So let's move on in time. So we're always on this balance. Human, divine. That's the balance. In the next century, there was a priest in Alexandria by the name of Arius. Very bright thinker, very articulate, and he lived from 250 to 336, so that's time frame. And again, I'm describing complex theological questions and trying to do it simply in a short period of time. But Arius was attempting to figure out the solution for this tension between Jesus being human and divine. And his solution was Jesus was a creature like you and me, but greater than any other creature. So less than God the Father, somewhere between God the Father and created beings. So a creature somewhere between God and human. And that was his core argument. So his bishop in Alexandria condemned this and said, "You're teaching heresy." Heresy, by the way, means you're teaching part of the truth, but not the whole truth. Now, until this point in the history of the church, the bishops, their successors of the apostles, they are the ones who make such decisions. But a conflict happened, and the Bishop of Jerusalem agreed with Arius. So now you have his own bishop in Alexandria condemning Arius, and you have a bishop in Jerusalem who is supporting Arius and saying he's correct in his attempt to solve the mystery of Jesus. So now we have bishops in conflict. Well, what happens in a church where you have bishops in conflict with each other? It doesn't usually go very well. Let's just put it that way. We can look at that through the rest of the history of Christianity. So we had to have a solution for this problem. And so who was the key figure in solving the problem? It was the newly converted Roman emperor. So Constantine decided that if he was going to have a Roman empire with one church, and he didn't make it the official religion of Rome, that didn't happen until later in the 4th century, but he did tolerate it. It was an edict of acceptance, of toleration, and he wanted the empire to have a peaceful coexistence. So he called together of the first ecumenical council in the history of the church in the city of Nicaea in 325. It's a pivotal moment, first time that the whole bishops, all the bishops of the known world were gathered together in one place, and Constantine said, basically, solve this problem. Come out with an agreed statement of faith, if you want to put it that way, about Jesus. And it was here at the Council of Nicaea, and these words hopefully will sound a little familiar to you, that the Council Fathers expressed it. I'm using an English translation. Originally all this was in Greek. They said, Jesus is God from God, light from light, true God from true God, born, begotten, that's what the word begotten means, born, not made, one in being or consubstantial with the Father. They used a Greek word, homoousios. That word, by the way, it's translated in English now in our creed on Sunday as consubstantial. If you wonder what does consubstantial mean? Well, it means homoousios. You just didn't know that, right, in Greek. So the Council Fathers, they actually had an extended discussion about what word to use to describe the relationship of the Father and the Son. Some of them wanted to use the word homoousios, which means like the Father. But the Council Fathers said, no, he's not just like the Father, but whatever the being is of the Father, the Son has identical being. We used to say, I like the old translation better in English. We used to say one in being with the Father. That's a more exact, actually, translation for us English speakers than consubstantial, because we don't know what consubstantial means unless you start digesting it, right? But whatever the being of the Father is, the Son has the exact same being. They share the same being. Both are God fully. So this key Greek word was the one that they chose. So the council condemned Arius as a heretic. And normally this would seem like it's the end of the discussion. So they reaffirmed Jesus' divinity, his oneness with the Father. But surprisingly, after the bishops went home to their home dioceses, many of them later on started kind of saying, well, we sort of agreed with Arius. So you had the beliefs of Arius continue to spread throughout the empire, and St. Jerome, the great biblical scholar who translated the whole scriptures into Latin, he said, you know, the world groaned to discover that the majority of Christians now believe like Arius. So he was deeply disturbed as a scripture scholar that the majority of Christians at one point seemed to take the side of Arius. Now, how did Arius make this argument? Well, he said he would quote the New Testament, right? In John's Gospel, what does Jesus say? Jesus says, the Father is greater than I. So Arius would quote that. This is what St. John's Gospel says. The Father is greater than I. So clearly Jesus is lesser than the Father. So some form of what we call subordinationism kept coming back. So a belief somehow that Jesus is subordinate or under the Father, less than the Father. So the debate in the church continued in the 4th century. And eventually, we also have sort of an opposite reaction. And there was a fellow by the name of Apollinaris who said Jesus was fully God. He wouldn't argue with Nicaea. But he said, therefore, Jesus had no human soul. He only had God's spirit. He may have had a human body, but he had no human soul. So Apollinaris said, no human soul. So you can tell that Apollinaris is defending the divinity of Jesus, but the consequence, he doesn't have a human soul like we do. So this necessitated a second ecumenical council, and they had a second one in the city of Constantinople in 381. You see how many decades later, they're still having these discussions and arguments across the Roman Empire. One of the early church fathers said, you couldn't hardly go to the baker or to the fish market without hearing a discussion. So people on the streets were actively discussing and debating these things. All of them quoted scripture, all of them quoted the New Testament. They had different understandings of the New Testament. And we might think it's odd, right, that there's this much energy that's invested into this discussion. But I often think in the 21st century, if you see what people really get into heated arguments about today, are any of those things as important as the person of Jesus? So in a sense, it shows you that at least that was their number one concern, right? So what is our number one concern, you know? You wonder if people mostly yawn about the person of Jesus in our modern civilized world, you know? So, although I must say that the most interesting recent thing that I heard sort of like that was when Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, came out, and there were lots of public discussions about, I've heard this somewhere over down the street in a restaurant, you know, what do you think? Do you think you're going to go see the movie or not? You know, is that appropriate that he did the movie that way or not? So it created a little of that kind of energy, but, you know, for the Christian community, this demanded clarity. So in 381, they gathered in Constantinople, and Apollinaris was condemned as a heretic. So the Council of Constantinople affirmed Jesus had a soul, a human soul, just like you and me. So, a human soul. So if Nicaea had to defend the divinity of Jesus, the Council of Constantinople had to defend his humanity. So the ideas that undergirded his thought, though, continued. So and particularly in Alexandria in Egypt, there was a strong school that emphasized Jesus' oneness with God. And so arguing for that oneness, they said in the end, Jesus may have had a human body, he may have had a human soul, but he only had one nature, and that's the nature of God. So they were called the Monophysitists. I don't know if I got the spelling right, I'm a Monophysitist, but only one nature, and that's a divine nature. So, in the meantime, you have a great patriarch in Constantinople by the name of Nestorius. Patriarchs, by the way, were important. There were only 5 patriarchal sees in the ancient church: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, Constantinople. So this is one of the big 5. Nestorius was not only a bishop, he was a patriarch. And what Nestorius basically argued was that it was inappropriate to speak about Mary as Mother of God, or in Greek, as Theotokos, or God-bearer. So in the prayers of the church in Greek, they had been speaking about Mary as Theotokos, as God-bearer, we translated into English as the Mother of God. And Nestorius said that's not correct, because Mary was the mother of the human part of Jesus. So she was the mother of Jesus' humanity, not of the mother of God himself. So he was probably trying to argue against the distortion that Mary was the mother, for example, of the Trinity, of God, Father, Son, and Spirit. So he's saying, you know, we can't really speak of her as mother of God, as Theotokos, because she was only the mother of his humanity, not his divinity. So, by the way, so I'm writing all these names on the board. So I told you all a month ago when I did part one, I did a semester-long course in Christology, and we had many weeks of studying these ancient teachings of the Church over the centuries. And every time the professor would begin to teach about the teaching, I would be taking notes thinking, oh, I believe that, I believe that. And then he would say, and then this was condemned by this council. I'd be like, no, I don't believe that. So I always say, if you ask people, like if I asked a high school class, tell me your beliefs about Jesus, I could probably get most of the heresies covered in a typical classroom if I needed to. So what was wrong with Nestorius' view? Well, all of these questions that are circling, we had to have another, guess what? Ecumenical Council of the Church, and this happened in the city of Ephesus in 431. If you're keeping up with the years, we now have more than a century of this, from the first council to this point, right? And the Council of Ephesus was called to address this, and basically they condemned Nestorius as a heretic. So the Patriarch was condemned. Why? It's not simply enough to affirm Jesus is fully human and fully divine, but he is also one person. You can't break him into two halves, a human half and a divine half. So the oneness of Jesus had to be reaffirmed by this council. So can you say Jesus was half human and half divine? The answer is that would be heresy, right? That's a version of Nestorianism. Fully human and fully divine, both. Now, does that sound like a mystery? It is. That the human mind cannot fully comprehend. So, I'd like to think that this would have resolved everything, but the discussions actually continued, and there were still arguments in both directions. By the way, monophysitism was also condemned. Jesus didn't just have a divine nature, he also had a fully human nature. Two natures, fully human, fully divine, yet one person. We do say one divine person. So in the end, they had, once more, 20 years later, in 451, in the Council of Chalcedon, the city of Chalcedon to call together another ecumenical council. That council was critically important for two reasons. It was the council that in the end gave us a lasting understanding of the person of Jesus. So you could say that the Council of Chalcedon finally put together a formula that expressed the mystery of the person of Jesus in such a way that fundamentally the great majority of Christians throughout the empire accepted it. So it brought an end to the centuries-long debates and discussion, and it's also the springboard. Every mainline Christian since Chalcedon uses Chalcedon as the fundamental starting point on reflecting on Jesus. It's the foundation of the rest of the history of Christianity in terms of the way that we understand the person of Jesus. I will only add, however, you always have these people that are trying to figure something new out. We did have one heresy that emerged after Chalcedon that's kind of interesting. And they said, well, he might have had a human nature, he might have had a human soul, he might have had a human body, but he only had a divine will. He didn't have a human will, because his will was always one with the Father, so he couldn't have had a human will. So that was also condemned later on. It's a heresy called monothelitism. So Jesus had a fully human will and a divine will, just like we have a human will. So when you start looking at it, that means Jesus had a human body, a human nature, a human soul, and a human will. So again, an affirmation protecting the humanity of Jesus, just as the divinity of Jesus had to be protected, and the oneness of Jesus. So I could ask some volunteers of an English translation for you of a part of the section of the Council of Chalcedon's definition. So everybody can jump on, I think I'll read plenty of them. So the paragraph that's in front of you is an English translation of the original Greek. You'll recognize elements of the creed that we recite every Sunday. The creed that we recite most Sundays, not the Apostles' Creed, but the other one, is called the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, going back to the councils of Nicaea and Constantinople. But Chalcedon is also reflective of that ancient creed. So if you look at the first line, the Council Fathers at Chalcedon say, following therefore the Holy Fathers, who would the Holy Fathers be? These would be all of the Apostolic Fathers like Ignatius, Irenaeus, those early saints, early bishops that have faithfully handed on the Christian faith. Following the Holy Fathers, we confess one and the same Son. Notice the oneness of Jesus, emphasized right there at the beginning. One and the same Son, who is our Lord Jesus Christ. And we all agree in teaching that this very same Son is complete in his deity, another English translation, complete in his divinity, in his godhood, and complete, the very same, in his humanity. Truly God and truly human. The very same one being composed of a rational soul, so a human soul, and a body, and the word coessential, and you see the Greek word there, homoousios, one with the Father as to his divinity, and the same word, homoousios, the same one in being with us, the very same one as to his humanity. So he's both one in being with God the Father with regards to his divinity, one in being with us with regards to his humanity. Being like us in every respect apart from sin, as to his divinity, he was born from the Father before all ages. As to his humanity, the very same one who was born in the last days from the Virgin Mary. And note the word, the Mother of God, the Greek is Theotokos, God-bearer. So they use that term. For our sake and the sake of our salvation, one and the same, again, the unity, Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten. And notice this next line, all of the adverbs. These adverbs are very important. Acknowledged to be unconfusedly. What does it mean? His divinity and humanity are not confused. They're not blended together. Like you blend milk and honey. So they're not confused together. Unalterably, what does that mean? It means that when God became human, it did not alter his divinity. And when God took on our humanity, it did not alter our humanity. So it didn't change his divinity when he became human, and it didn't change our humanity when he took it on in his divinity. Undividedly, so you can't divide or separate the human and divine in Jesus. It's not dividable, but it's also not separable. You can't separate the two. So unconfusedly, unalterably, undividedly, inseparably in two natures, since the difference of the natures is not destroyed because of the union, but on the contrary, the character of each nature is preserved and comes together in one person. The word hypostasis is a word for person, not divided or torn into two persons, but one and the same Son and only begotten God, Logos, Lord Jesus Christ. Just as in earlier times the prophets and also the Lord Jesus himself taught us about him, and the symbol, that's the creed of our fathers, transmitted to us. That will be what we call the creeds today, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. So, I know this is complex, but isn't it, in its own way, beautiful? This is capturing the whole mystery of Jesus. That's why today, if you ask people, was Jesus God? Most Christians will say what? Yes. Was he human? Most Christians will say yes. Was he one? Yes. So we almost take for granted what took centuries of clarity to come to. And I say this because Christianity, it's not like the things that we believe today fell out of heaven prepackaged, right? There was a historical development that required great suffering and struggle, and people died with their beliefs about Jesus all the way across the board. They suffered for them. So they were willing to suffer and die for what they believed about him, and there was a great workings out that had to take place. So I always say that should also remind us today, if we have struggles in the church to come together in unity around certain topics, we shouldn't be worried about that. If the early Christian community had to struggle equally, then we understand God's work is happening in the church, and it takes time sometimes for that clarity to come. So that should give us a greater trust in the working of God, I think, in this very human unfolding church that is still developing in time and history. So that's one of the things that I think is beautiful, and that's why I think the person of Jesus can never be adequately, you can never run out of desire to know him more, to love him more, and to follow him more closely. So, all right, so many, many years ago, when I was teaching about Jesus, that's the way I would finish my class. And then I finally thought, I don't want to stop there. So what I did was, I went back and I said, so why should we believe in Jesus to begin with? Why follow him? Why entrust our lives to his care? And so I looked at qualities about Jesus that I found, for me personally, most important, and I selected 10 of them. So I'm going to share those 10 with you. Number 1, Jesus was fully human. So that's what we've been talking about tonight. Why is that so important? Because the early church fathers would say, if he didn't become human, then he couldn't save us human beings. He had to become one with us in order to save us. But I think even more than that, we do not have a God who doesn't understand what it's like to walk the human journey. You and I, everything we go through in life, the woundedness of human life, the darkness at times, loneliness, depression. We have a Jesus who on the cross in Mark's Gospels we saw could say, my God, why have you abandoned me? We have a Jesus who is able to weep over the death of his friend Lazarus. We have a Jesus who could weep over the city of Jerusalem and say, how I've longed to gather you, but you've gone so far away from me. So a fully human God who understands every single thing you and I experience, the one exception being that he never turned from God and sinned. So he became one with us in solidarity and love and sin, but never sinned himself. But other than that, every human experience that you and I will experience in life, being bodily, corporeal, God knows it from the inside. There was a song back in the 1990s done by a Kentucky pop music artist. Do you remember the song, What If God Was One of Us? It was kind of a very catchy hymn. What if God was one of us, just like a slob like one of us, all alone on a bus trying to find his way home? She grew up in a Christian church and was hurt by the experience, so she wasn't a believer when she wrote the song. But my answer to the song was always, God was one of us. He did choose to be alone on the bus, trying to find his way home. He allowed himself to enter fully into our human condition, our human exile. So he understands the suffering we go through. So God did become one of us. Second quality, fully divine. Now, why is this so important? Because in our world today, there are lots of competing definitions of what the ultimate mystery is, what God is. Is God cruel? Is God capricious? Is God like the Greek and Roman gods of the Roman and Greek pantheons, who make love and fight wars and delight in human suffering, as the Greek and Roman gods did? What is God really like? If we believe that Jesus is fully God, then all we have to do is look at the person of Jesus and the way he lived his life and the way he loved and died to see who God really is, the face of God. So for me, the fact that Jesus is the face of God makes clear the mystery of God himself. So we understand God because God has become fully incarnate in Jesus. So for me, those two qualities are key. The other 8 qualities all flow out of those two in some way or another. Number 3, I say, is healing presence. When you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can't help but be struck by the fact that when people were in need of healing and Jesus was there, miracles happened. So the deaf could hear, the mute could speak, the lame could walk, the lepers were healed. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, one commentator noted every single part of the human body gets healed by Jesus. And the deepest healing we need is healing from estrangement from God, which is the healing, the wound of sin, which has separated us from God. So Jesus is the great healer. I always say that people were drawn to Jesus like moths are drawn to a light in the summertime. There was something about Jesus that drew people. Number 4 is love and compassion. I think that is what drew them. Remember the moment when Jesus says to the apostles, let's get in the boat and go to the other side of the lake. And they arrive on the shore, and there's 1,000 people waiting for them, thousands of people waiting for them. And the gospel writers tell us the heart of Jesus was moved with compassion. He had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them. And that's right before he'll feed them with the loaves and fishes. So the compassion of Jesus for suffering humanity, his love for them. And for me, some of the greatest parables found in the Gospel of Luke exemplify that compassion. The Greek word for compassion means gut-wrenching. When you see somebody suffering and your gut turns, the Greek word for compassion has that meaning to it. And when Jesus speaks about compassion in the Gospel of Luke, one of my favorite parables is the parable of the son who is lost. And the father sees him from a long distance And it says his heart was moved with compassion. He ran out to his son and embraced him and kissed him, put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. That's the compassion of love of God embodied. Number 5, the way he included the little ones, the outsiders, the least ones. So much of human life, don't we have us and them? We're good, they're bad. The separation. And Jesus' heart he's always including the people on the fringes. The Samaritans, the sick, the sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the little ones. It's the people on the fringes who most need attention that he's drawn to. They said one time Mother Teresa of Calcutta was walking on a busy street in New York surrounded by reporters, and they were all chatting with her, and suddenly they noticed that she was not paying attention to any of them. And they looked at her face again, and her eyes were across the street, and they followed her eyes, and she was looking at a beggar lying in the gutter. That's immediately where her attention went, to that poor person left alone on the side of the road. And that's exactly what happens to Jesus. He's reaching out. So anybody that feels marginalized, excluded, the little ones, how often does Jesus say the first shall be last and the last shall be first? You know, it's the world turned upside down. And Mary, his mother, proclaims, he has cast down the mighty ones. He's lifted up the lowly ones. He's filled the hungry with good things. The rich, he has sent away empty. That's the great prayer of Mary that we do every evening in the evening prayer of the church. Well, so Jesus learned something from his mother's inclusion of the little ones. This God's strange reordering of this human world that we're living in. Number 6. Jesus' radical challenge to each and every one of us. He never says it's okay to be mediocre. He is always calling us to be the very best son or daughter that God created us to be. When you read the New Testament, that becomes clear. He says, listen, you got to follow me. If your hand is the problem, cut it off. If your eye is the problem, gouge it out. Better to enter the kingdom of heaven with one eye than to go to Gehenna with both eyes in, And then he says, if you want to follow me, you're going to have to die to yourself. Take up your cross and follow in my footsteps. Wow. The words of Jesus challenge us. You've heard it said of old, you shall not kill. I say, do not grow angry with another. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. I say, don't even look with lust at another. This challenge of Jesus is leading us to a remarkable new place. He's always drawing us to become the best, Matthew Kelly puts it, the best version of ourselves, right? He created us to be a certain way, and he's never going to be content until we're fully the new creation. Number 7, his remarkable freedom. A lot of times when you hang around religious people, they can be very restrictive. They want to tell everybody what to do and how to do it, and they kind of do that to themselves. But Jesus had this incredible freedom. Even with regard to God's law, the Sabbath, he said at one point, he said, human beings were not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for human beings. He said, haven't you read what David and his men did when they were hungry? They went to the place where the holy bread that only the priest were supposed to eat. And he says, that's why the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So he had this incredible freedom, and the people around him were set free. You don't have to live in shame any longer. You don't have to be entrapped by people's judgments of you, or by the bondage of sin. I came to set you free, not to live in servitude to destructive impulses or people. All right? You're free to be the daughter or son that God created you to be. 8, his communion with his Father, with God. He called God Abba, Dad, in Aramaic, and he would go spend hours alone with the Father up on the mountaintop, out in the wilderness. He was drawn to be apart with God. And that union he shared with the Father, others were drawn to that. The apostles came to him one time and they said, Lord, would you teach us to pray? As John taught his disciples, they saw that communion in Jesus. 9, the way he died for us. I often think if you read the narratives of the Passion of Jesus, the incredible suffering, and yet he never becomes bitter, he never becomes vengeful towards those who are crucifying him, but as he dies, he's saying, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Into your hands, Father, I entrust my spirit. The loving trust he had in the will of the Father for him, and the gift of himself freely for us in total self-emptying on the cross. To me, that I could spend a lifetime pondering that alone. And the last, his ongoing presence with us. All of these other things I've mentioned would be profound indeed if they were all past tense alone, but the fact that Jesus is alive and present here and now, this ongoing presence with us, to me is profound. And he promised, I will be with you always till the end of time. I will come to you. The Father and I will come, will make our home in you. We will send the Paraclete. The Paraclete will be within you. You'll be the home of the Paraclete. And the Father and I will dwell in you. Where 2 or 3 of you gather in my name, I'm with you. Whatever you do for the least ones, you're doing for me. I'm in the hungry and the thirsty and the imprisoned and so forth. So Jesus is right here with us now, risen from the dead, this ongoing gift of his presence with us always and everywhere. So I always felt like I should end on those 10 personal qualities I appreciate most about Jesus from the Gospels as a spiritual way of ending my quick tour of the history of Christology. So, all right, any questions? I also have these 10 qualities for you. If you want a copy, take a mic. They'll be available on the back table as you go. So I printed them up in case you didn't want to take those. You took them, that's okay too. Questions, comments, observations? Yes?
Besides the fact that he is fully divine, fully God, how do we know that Jesus did not sin? I feel like there are a few things that people could probably see as maybe, like when, I don't know, when he was angry and overturned tables, or when he left and didn't tell his parents where he was, or how, I don't know, is there anything that we...
So what we as Orthodox Christians believe is that Jesus always and everywhere conformed his will to the will of the Father. So he never deviated from the will of God for him, which means that his choice as a 12-year-old to remain in the temple with the Father was in union with the Father's will for him, even though it caused suffering to Mary and Joseph. He was doing what, but afterwards, when they asked him not to do this again, he respected them on a human level. The turning of the tables in the temple, this is not an emotional reaction on Jesus' part, losing his temper. This is the act of God, so it was fully conformed to the will of God. Something is wrong in the house of God, and that needs to be claimed. And so anger itself in the world of broken human sin can be an authentic expression of God's will. So not all anger is evil or sinful. Yeah. Yeah.
Father Mark, the passage you mentioned where Jesus felt compassion and then taught them, that be an example of him being human and divine?
Yeah, being compassionate is both from the heart of God and the heart of humanity. Yeah, that quality of compassion is fully God-like and also fully human. So that's, I would say, the oneness of Jesus expressing both natures at once.
So if the councils met and made these decisions, and then they meet again in 2122, and they decide something else, what's left of the people that believe what we were? I mean, I know that's the people that agreed with.
Like who agreed with Arius, for example?
Right, and thought that, and then that was condemned, and then 100 years went by and something else was agreed upon by council. If that happens again, are we heretics for believing what we believe now?
So heresy is a partial truth. So you get something about it right, but there's something that you leave out that's essential. And the church has an obligation to be certain that the gospel is handed forth whole and entire. So that's why it's important when it sees that there's a deviation from where the faith of the church ought to be, that they have clarity about it and articulate it clearly. If we were wrong about something and through no fault of our own, God does not condemn us, right? So the only thing God condemns is willful heresy. When I know it's not correct and I continue to teach it. When I know it's not the truth of the gospel and I continue to pervade it. We all at times, like, as I said, when I was taking notes on this, I'm like, I believe that. That's a great teaching. And this was because I was like, I guess I better not believe that. So. And by the way, this is so different than Protestantism because in Protestantism, each person can decide for himself what his own private interpretation of the New Testament is. So you're going to have 100 different beliefs about Jesus in the end. Even though mainline churches have come up with statements of faith that bind them together. Depends how far across that spectrum you are, all the way to the one extreme.
Humans being made in the likeness or in the image of God, how does that interface with Jesus being fully human and fully God? It seems a bit redundant for him to be God and in the image of God.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Is it redundant? Because humans are already created in the image and likeness of God. In the beginning, when humans are created, we are created in the image and likeness of God, but we are distinct from the Creator. And so we are, though in the image and likeness of God, we are not created as God. Now, we do say, this is a bold Christian claim, it's an ancient Christian claim, that when Jesus chose to become fully human and redeem us through his death and resurrection on the cross, he has not only freed us from the slavery to sin, but he has now also made us one with God. So we are given a higher place than we had at the moment of creation. They would use the word we're divinized. We're becoming one with God by grace. So we're entering into the life of God by God's gracious invitation. So we truly become God-like by the gracious gift of God, not by nature. That God doesn't simply restore us where we were in the beginning. We're better as a result of what happened in the incarnation, death, and resurrection. Any other questions? So I want to leave you with one question in your own mind. So I told you my favorite qualities about Jesus, the 10 most attractive. Think about Jesus for yourself. Are there qualities about Jesus that draw you to him, that make you want to follow him and be wholly his? that I didn't mention? And if they are, treasure those qualities. Write them down, note them. So we probably could all do our own constellation of qualities. All right, we're going to have discussions of the tables, and the sponsors and/or their proxies are going to come with me to the church to get ready for Sunday's rite. Right? We'll play on words.